Let's pick things up there for tonight's Dateline Defense. Joining me, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer. He's a CIA-trained Senior Intelligence Operations Officer, best-selling author, and Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research.
Hey, Morris.
Tony, this was a large-scale attack. Dozens were killed, scores were injured. U.S. officials say the explosives appear to be sophisticated.
Right.
What does that mean? Talk about the implications.
Well, also, these individuals were dressed very much in Western pattern. They blended right in.
Right.
And also, the sophistication of the dead man switch, those gloves they were wearing, that wasn't an homage to Michael Jackson. Those are basically switches that once you push down on that, even if they shoot you in the head, it's going to go off. So this was a very well-planned attack. My estimation, this was in the works probably before the Paris attacks even. So what it tells me is that we need to be very vigilant here. We need to do two things immediately. Again, lessons learned. We talked about this after the Paris attack. Look what went wrong there and try to get ahead of them. Secondly, we have to look at the threat pattern here. How did they do this? How did they achieve getting the explosives? How did they wire them? And then look at our own vulnerabilities here. Morris, you and I talked about before, I have a lot of experience doing something called red teaming. That's where we as intelligence officers put ourselves in the threat's shoes. So much like what happened here in Belgium with the attacks against the transportation centers, we have our own vulnerabilities, and that's something we have to look at very seriously.
Tony, international airports, including 3 in New York, boosted security after these bombings, but officials say there's no credible threat to the U.S. What does the security ramp-up do? I
don't believe them. I think that they do know there's a threat. For those who were here in Washington last week, there was a higher, if you looked around, there was a higher presence of security all over the city, to include the metro. So they know something's going on. And I'm not saying we should panic the public. I'm saying the public must be very vigilant. And we have to recognize that TSA, by the way, has had a bad attitude lately. They've been slowing down the processing of passengers through the security checkpoints, which has created huge queues. And Morris, places like LA, LaGuardia, Dulles, where you have large numbers of people standing in line near the entranceways where there's no security or minimal security, that's where they're going to go for. That's what they went for here. So we have to recognize that we have created our own vulnerability, with TSA having a tantrum right now, slowing down because they didn't do their job and now they want to make the American public pay by making their life more difficult going through security. TSA is actually contributing to the potential for an attack. And again, why should you worry about getting a bomb on an airplane when you can kill as many people in the terminal without having to breach any of the security measures that are in place?
That's right. Go for the maximum effect. And now it's not on the plane, it's in the lines.
Absolutely.
All right. Federal prosecutor's office in Belgium made a new plea to the media not to spread information about the investigation. They made a similar request after the Paris attacks. I'm curious, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't agree. I think one of the things the public has to do in any situation like this is maximize their vigilance and talk about it. Try to figure out what's going on. I think the more you try to basically say that this is an issue with the Muslim community and try to downplay it is how that's what they feed on. We have to get it out in the open. We have to define the adversary for who they are. And part of the problem with Belgium, frankly, is the fact that Belgium did not control their intake of refugees. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that it is what it is. And so when you have these large communities which are unassimilated, that is to say that they have these clusters, it makes it easier for the radicals to hide in. This is a great camouflage for them. So this is where the Muslim community itself has to take more of an active role in defending itself by the fact that they should not allow these radicals to find safe haven, to find time and method to plan. And that's what the Belgians have to get behind and figure out how to stop the next attack.
Defense Secretary Ash Carter was on Capitol Hill today. He made it a point to address the Belgium attacks.
Right.
Well, and in the face of these acts of terrorism, the United States stands in strong solidarity with our ally, Belgium. We're continuing to monitor the situation, including to ensure that all U.S. personnel and citizens are accounted for. We also stand ready to provide assistance to our friends and allies in Europe as necessary.
Carter also noted Brussels is an international city, host to NATO and the European Union for decades. How important is Belgium to the U.S. military, Tony?
It's hugely important. I mean, we have to recognize that after World War II, Belgium became kind of the center of activity for NATO and other activities. At this point in time, NATO is becoming a much bigger issue by the fact that we have the Russians, I'll be blunt, doing things that NATO needs to be concerned about. So it's a very important military hub. With that said, I think the Pentagon is also trying to look at how to look at conducting operations overseas to stop ISIS from coming to the homeland. I know for a fact the Pentagon is looking at that. So I think it's something the Pentagon should look at and do. And again, Morris, we have to look at how we can both support our allies, such as the Belgians, as well as look at how we can go after ISIS and their planning overseas before it gets here.
All right, let's focus on strategy. These attacks, whether carried out by or inspired by ISIS, keep happening in spite of international pressure. Critics argue the Obama administration is not doing enough.
The critics are correct.
But I'm afraid these random acts of terrorism will not end anytime soon. I believe the time has come for President Obama to create a complete and thorough strategy to defeat ISIS, a plan that will give our military leaders and soldiers the tools that they need to destroy ISIS once and for all.
All right, Tony, does the U.S. military have a strategy? If so, why isn't it working? And if not, why not?
Well, her point is well taken. These are not, and I disagree with her, it's not random, these are well planned. The problem is this, the Pentagon, while it does have a strategy and plan, is but one aspect of our government. We have multiple tools of national will, the State Department, Commerce, everything else. Right now, the Pentagon is essentially fighting the war by itself. We have to have a strategy put forth by the National Security Council, by the White House. They have refused to do that. So while I'm confident the Pentagon is doing everything it can to put together a strategy and execute that strategy with better tactics, the Pentagon cannot win this war by itself. Military effort will not win this war. We have to look at the psychological aspects, we have to look at the media aspects, and we have to look at the economic and diplomatic aspects. Those elements have not been brought to bear yet, and frankly, that's something that has to be done if we're going to beat ISIS effectively.
Tony, in about 30 seconds before you go, I'd like to talk about Russia. Their foreign ministry says the politics of double standards by the West have led to terrorist attacks and that frozen diplomatic relations between NATO and Russia have slowed the fight against terrorism. What is the Kremlin angling for here?
The Kremlin's angling for more influence. There's an old adage, what's Russian is Russian, what's yours is negotiable. So that's what they're going for here. But with that said, we have done some things in the Middle East, such as the failure of Libya, which has led to an enhancement for terrorists to take ground, in Iraq as well. So they are correct in that aspect. Otherwise, the Russians are out for themselves, and we have to understand that as part of their strategy.
It's always great to get your insight. Right. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer, Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Morris.